everybody, and welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine, where we talk about the week's hottest legal topics. Up this week, we have hot topics. We are going to be talking about Trump's potential, maybe confirmed defiance of court orders by actual federal judges. This is kind of a three-part series where last week we did a series, the beginning of the series, with the defiance of a judge's order requiring the government to pay $2 billion in USAID funds to USAID. That was one defiance. Today, we're going to hit the second one. We believe that there are technically three. So the second one would be the deportation of Venezuelans. And the third one that we're counting as a defiance of court orders would be the removal or the deportation of the Brown University doctor and professor. So those are our three claims of what Trump did or possibly did defy in actual court orders. Again, today we're going to take up what we call the second one, which is the deportation of Venezuelans. So join us as we discuss that for part two of our series. I'm Virginia Tirani. I'm the owner and attorney for Tirani Law, LLC, because you never need a lawyer till you do. I'm also the CEO of The Law Unscripted, which hosts this podcast, The Legal Weekly Wine. And I am joined by my co-host, Dr. John Weil, who is the Dean of the Honors College of Middle Tennessee State University. Welcome back.
Good to be here.
All right. So you are our Constitution scholar, our scholar of the amending process and constitutional law. We have got a doozy for you today. Because,
we do. It's very interesting. The term isn't in the Constitution, but there are a lot of people asking whether we are in a so-called constitutional crisis.
Yes.
Depends on how you define it. Partly, it's one of those things we may not know until 5 years from now or 20 years from now.
Right.
But there's a lot of discussion right now on constitutional issues. I think we've mentioned this before, that Americans used to joke that the French Constitution was a form of periodic literature, and we haven't actually changed the physical words in the Constitution for some time, but we are getting ever increasingly unusual interpretations of the Constitution that are passing for constitutional law.
Absolutely. And this is a big question of the territory we're entering is, what are the actual powers of the three branches of government, and in this particular case, the executive versus the judicial. So we're going to talk about that. I'd love to hear your opinion by the end, so stay tuned, everybody, as to what Dr. Weil thinks. Is this an actual constitutional crisis? And where do we think that the courts would or should fall based on our interpretations of the Constitution and the law with regard to executive versus judicial power? We have talked about this in our prior episodes, so do check those out to catch up with us. But in the meantime, we are the Weekly Wine. I have not brought wine today. I have ventured out a little bit. Honestly, this topic stresses me out. I think I might be getting ulcers because of it. So I'm going to add to the ulcers by going straight to liquor today. I'm not driving anywhere. It's one glass, but I have made for myself an amaretto sour. So you can see the beauty of the amaretto with the sweet and sour mixture and some grenadine and a couple of cherries found in there. I'm not going to eat the cherries while I'm on because that ends up being a little bit of a mess, and I don't want it on, national YouTube. Dr. Weil is drinking out of our famous cup. It is, what's it say for us?
Allegedly, this is coffee.
Yes.
It's actually Pepsi. Yes, Pepsi.
Yes. So you are drinking Pepsi. It's not the actual, alcohol in it, or the coffee, but I love that you're using, our coffee tumbler. If you guys want one, we have it in purple and in black. Check out thelawunscripted.com. Look under merchandise. You'll find that coffee tumbler as well as other fun, legal shirts, legal sayings. Give yourself a chuckle, wear them around, give others a chuckle, and, see how that goes. Because right now, any of us could use a little chuckle. So I'm going to chuckle at that cup and move on to things that seriously, I'm trying to restrain myself. As an attorney, I've been an attorney for 19 and a half years. And to me, this is the most upsetting topic because it deals with, yes, it's the executive, but honestly, we're getting into the legal world that I deal with every day. When you're in court, when you have a judge's order, what counts as a judge's order? What are you supposed to do with regard to a judge's order? And now, is the president subject to a judge's order, or have we put that aside? So, Dr. Vile, we are talking right now about deportation of roughly, I wish I knew the numbers a little better, but roughly 300 what are called illegal immigrants who are Venezuelan specifically. I'm terrible at pronunciation, but they are supposedly part of a gang, a specific gang called, gosh, I can't pronounce this. Dr. Vile, do you have any better pronunciation that I can put you on the spot for?
What are the initials? ALD, is that right?
TDA.
EDA.
TDA.
Let's go with that.
Yeah, TDA. It's Tren de something. Aragua. Again, I'll laugh at me. I don't speak Spanish, but it's a gang, a Venezuelan gang. Thank you, Dr. Vile. We'll go with those initials or just Venezuelan gang, where those members, alleged members, have been deported over the weekend, this last weekend. This is the middle of March. And what I want to do is ask you, first of all, what grounds is the president using to do this deportation? Because it's not the normal immigration rules.
So, if individuals would ever care to read a book of original documents dealing with immigration, it's now about 8 or 10 years old. Let's see. Published in 2016. So it's almost 10 years old. But one of the laws that I have in the early part of the book is something known as an act respecting alien enemies. It was adopted in 1798, along with two other very notorious laws that have since been suspended. One is the Alien Act, which made it more difficult for individuals to become citizens, and the other was the Sedition Act, which made it a criticism to criticize the government or the president of the United States. Those were purposely designed to lapse so that if, as he was, Thomas Jefferson were elected, he would not be able to use the same power. So that tells you the partisan nature.
And
but
so
the alien,
all three of these, you're
pardon?
saying, I mean, this is the 18th century. This is what, 1798?
Right. This law has been, to my knowledge, I'll probably get it wrong, it's been evoked 3 times.
Yes.
One during the War of 1812, one during World War I, and one during World War II.
Correct.
And World War II is probably the most notorious because this was partially the basis for the president's executive order that incarcerated more than 100,000 Americans of Japanese descent, and has since actually been directly repudiated by Congress, which has passed reparations for those who were still alive, and also has been indirectly overturned by the Supreme Court. But it was designed to allow for the United States, if we had a war with a declared war against a foreign country, that you could deport individuals from those countries back to their home country. It was designed, I shouldn't say it was a time before terrorism, because it depends on how you define terrorism.
Right.
But it was designed with state entities in mind. In other words, other nation states. It wasn't designed to deal with international terrorist organizations. So that makes it a little problematic. But secondly, it was designed to deal with nations with which we had declared, against which we had declared war. So my understanding is it wasn't actually applied. 1798, we were in an undeclared war with France, but President Adams was able to avoid full-scale war. And to my knowledge, we did not use this to deport anybody back to France because we weren't actually at war with them. But we're not in a war with Venezuela right now.
Right. There is
Um,
that seems to be the issue is World War I and World War II. I mean, those were actual quote wars that
right,
Congress had declared against other countries.
right. And this is neither a country nor is it a declared war. So, and the fact that it's only been used three times in American history, so it's been dormant for what, 75 years or so.
Yes.
And the last time it was used, most Americans consider that to be sort of a low point of civil liberties in the United States, namely the Japanese incarceration. So
Right. And I believe it was actually 1943 was when it was invoked.
well, that would be, so close to what, 20,
Yeah.
80, 85 years, somewhere along in there.
Exactly. And to me, it's like, we didn't use it in the Vietnam War. We didn't use it in the Korean War. We haven't even used it in the wars with Iraq and
Right.
Afghanistan. Even when we had a war on terror, even with the
And
World Trade Center, we
where I
haven't
think
invoked
we'll probably
it.
lose viewer or listeners is in some ways what Trump has done seems very common sense.
Sure.
If we know, I mean, there are gangs that you can pretty much now. If you're this also only applies to people over 14 years of age.
Well,
So
14 and older, I think. But
yeah, well,
still, that's
right,
fairly
14 and
young.
older. So that's important because it's possible that some of the people that rounded up are not 14 years of age. But there are some, if you're a member of the Ku Klux Klan and you're not a government agent, my suspicion is that I can attribute most of what the Klan believes to you. And,
Sure.
if the Klan participates in activities, I can pretty much assume that you're going to be a member of them. And,
Yeah.
gangs in the United States.
Yes.
If you came to, if you needed a search warrant for someone and you could show me that he was a member of a certain gang and living at a certain address,
Yes.
I probably, as a judge, would say that's probable cause to investigate, to go to his house with
Yeah.
a warrant.
And I'll say this. I used to be a prosecutor in Newport News, Virginia, which was at the time the sixth most dangerous, most violent city in Virginia. And when I was there, I was actually on the drug, gun, and gang unit for prosecution. I prosecuted gang members. And part of our burden of proof was to prove that they were gang members. And then if we could prove that they were a member of that gang, then we could attribute the acts of the gang to them. So we would set out, here's our proof as to, whether it was tattoos, whether it was association with specific gang members, whether it was pictures or videos that they had posted where they're doing gang signs, where they're wearing gang colors, whether we could place them at scenes of crimes that were committed, and we could prosecute them and detain them based on the criminal activities of their gangs, exactly like you're saying, and with actual gangs, whether that was MS-13 or other.
The public may not be as exercised about this as you and I would be, is that who could oppose sending a violent druggist, rapist, murderer out of the country?
Nobody wants
And the
to.
answer is nobody is opposed to. I mean, nobody who's compos mentis
right
would oppose that. But the more fundamental issue is, did we actually take care and do we know for sure that the people that we deported actually were gang members or actually did commit violence? And there's a circularity in arguments here. Apparently, the government seems unwilling to tell what the evidence is that they have.
or
And
even identify
in some
the
cases,
people.
they say, well, we acknowledge that there's no criminal record here, but they haven't been here long enough, which means, you're buying into every immigrant or every immigrant gang member must be, involved in drugs, rape, or murder.
Right. And in
that,
this case,
any of us, I mean, but for the color maybe of our skin and the fact that I don't have an accent, anybody could get caught up in this.
Yes. And that's absolutely true. We've got, the gangs that I dealt with in Newport News, some of them were Hispanic. Some of them were black. And it's a question of, do you just round up all the black men who are located on this street? Do you round up all of the Hispanics that go to this church? What's the limitation? And in my mind, we're avoiding due process.
Absolutely.
Where is that hearing to determine that they are gang members? I'm not saying that they're not. I don't know. But that's a question for the courts. I have no problem with a hearing being held, a determination being made, and deportation. I have no problem with those who are already convicted criminals who have an ICE hold on them. Go ahead and take them and deport them. That's a proper use of our deportation and immigration system. Yes, there's the fear, but start with the ones we already know. The mass roundups and the deportation based on this invoked rule just seems to completely violate due process. And I guess that's the point of the rule, right? The idea of using this rule is you don't have to have due process for those who are rounded up.
Right. I mean, it's like, what a waste that we put 100 and some thousand people, loyal Japanese Americans, in detention during World War II. And you may know this, if I recall correctly, the most decorated unit during World War II was a group of Japanese Americans. They wouldn't send them to the Far East, but they sent them to Italy. And they had this outstanding record of, support for the United States. You cannot assume that everybody, Venezuela is not a good place to be right now.
Absolutely not.
It's under control of a dictator. And many of those people who came here are coming probably for the same reason that our ancestors came. They wanted religious liberty. They wanted freedom of speech. They wanted
safety.
The ability to have their own businesses and that sort of thing.
Right. Some are true asylum seekers.
Sure.
So with this Alien Enemies Act, I want to turn to some of the actual language of it that Donald Trump and his administration are using. Is they're claiming, and as you're saying, it's usually to deport those involved in a declared war against a country. But the way that it's saying is there's phrases in there of during, quote, a time of war.
Right.
During, quote, an invasion. During a, quote, predatory incursion. So these are the terms that the president in his executive order that was signed on last Friday and then entered or published to the press and to the nation on Saturday on a weekend is that this particular gang is involved in a predatory incursion, an invasion of the country, and is in a war of terror against the United States. Dr. Vial, I go back to yours. Yeah, go ahead.
The only declared war that I know about in the Constitution is a power that's specifically reserved to Congress.
Right.
Congress has the power to declare war. The president then has the power as commander-in-chief to wage war.
Right.
But the language actually in the very second sentence of the act, whenever there shall be a declared war between the United States and any foreign nation or government, or any invasion or predatory incursion shall be perpetuated, attempted, or threatened against the territory by a foreign nation or government, etc., etc. These do not all fit that. And yes, the president has declared that he thinks immigrants are an invasion.
Right.
But that is so far from the original understanding of what an invasion is what happened when Ukraine attacked Russia, right?
or Russia attacked Ukraine, depending on your interpretation.
When Russia, when you send your troops into a foreign country, that's an invasion.
Right.
When
the Japanese bombing here, Pearl Harbor is an invasion.
That is an invasion, absolutely.
That is an act of war. In this case, we don't have the Venezuelan army outside of Texas, going through Mexico or sending planes to bomb us. We have a gang. So as you're saying, what Trump is doing is declaring a gang as part of this, which is not Venezuela, which is not the Venezuelan government. Again, I go back to, I'm not saying they should be here. I'm not.
Neither of us are.
And I don't want...
Nor is the judge, by the way.
Right, exactly. Nor is the judge. It's not like I want them here. Most of us, like, we go back to what you were saying, is we're in agreement that these types of people should be deported, but use the normal process. Yes, it takes longer. Yes, there's due process that has to be done. Yes, there's immigration courts and orders and hearings, but that's the process we have set up for these types of issues. And I'm in agreement as this doesn't seem to fit this order or this act. So
it doesn't, and I should say there may be other aspects of law that could be used. In some ways, I think Trump called unusual, when you got to go back 200 almost 50 years to find a precedent for something.
Yeah.
That in and of itself is sort of a warning light that something odd is going on here.
Sure. And in this case, the other question that I have, and I think what is logically flowing from this is, if the use of this act has given him either actual authority through the Constitution, through interpretation, which it could. We don't know the ending decision of the judiciary. But if it doesn't give him the constitutional right to do so, will he expand this to, the logical next one would be MS-13, right? To another gang through, a Latin origin gang. MS-13 is notorious for extreme violence, and a lot of, especially taking over specific cities.
I think he's already indicated that he thinks it applies to them.
So where does it stop? Again, I don't like MS-13.
That wouldn't bother me. You can deport MS-13 gang members.
Absolutely, please.
The issue is, we used to say, and I think you were probably taught in law school. I think it was Justice Brandeis, and sometimes it's 10, sometimes it's 100, but it's better that 10 guilty people go free than that one innocent person be punished.
Right.
I don't know what the ratio should be, but we understand the logic of that. We know people probably that we think got by with murder, literally.
Of course.
Because they had the same rights as everybody else, and they were able to use them in a way that protected them probably against proper punishment.
Right.
But we don't throw out the whole system. We say, well, the good thing about that is here are some innocent people who, because the standards of proof were so high, also didn't get convicted. So there's a kind of balancing here. But basically, my understanding is this order, the president lines up 300 people, several plane loads, and says we're going to take them to El Salvador
and Honduras.
Made a deal with the president there. They have a notoriously harsh prison there. We're going to put them on a plane, and the judge says, hold on, we need to make sure that the people you're deporting are deportable. And are you using the proper authority?
Right. Is this constitutional?
Right. Is it? And he indicated, by the way, that there may be other authority other than the 1798 Alien Enemies Act that you can use, but we have to adjudicate it before you send it.
Exactly. He said, let's put pause. Let's put a pause. So
the government says, government goes ahead and starts sending them, and they say, well, you didn't put it in writing.
Right.
You told us verbally, and then he said, well, you need to turn the planes around. And I have some concern with this one, by the way.
Sure.
I'm not, I think that board, whether, for one thing, you may not be able to turn a plane around. It may not have enough fuel. There could be all kinds of practical considerations. But there they essentially say, well, you no longer have jurisdiction because they're in international waters.
Right.
Which impresses me as poppycock. I may be wrong. It's a legal term, right?
Yeah, poppycock. I use it all the time in my briefs.
um, and now the latest, by the way, and it's a beautifully drafted. I mean, if you like language, and I think it was just yesterday. I don't know if I have a date on this, but I think it was either today or yesterday. The the judge who realizes now that his orders were ignored,
Yes.
that the planes lifted off because he had only said it verbally, and then when he told them to turn around, he didn't turn around. So he's now said, I want all the evidence.
Yes.
Actually, I think he said by last Friday they didn't comply.
Well,
now
I think
he
it was
says,
by Monday.
Okay, now he says by 12 o'clock today, and the government says this has devolved in, and I'm quoting, into a picayune dispute over the micromanagement of immaterial fact-finding. Meaning,
I think it's
the
immaterial.
hell with due process.
Exactly. It's not
means.
immaterial. And they're also saying, well, it's national security, so we don't have to give you that information. We can't divulge the information.
And, it's, to be cautious here, courts are very reluctant to interfere with matters of foreign policy.
Absolutely.
Now, they're less reluctant if they deal with domestic affairs. We talked about the Youngstown steel seizure case, where the court did say a president doesn't have the power to seize steel mills, even during a time of war. But chances are, if this case is appealed, it might ultimately come down to the court saying, we don't really think we have authority to order a president to send planes back.
Well, and I think that's one issue. Okay,
it's not nearly as important probably as the issue of were they given due process.
Right. Can he even use this act? To me, it's a secondary issue.
And the government is saying, well, this information is so top secret, we can't even reveal it. And by the way, there's a fascinating parallel here with the Korematsu, the Japanese internment case.
Right.
The military authorities said, we have to admit that we haven't seen Japanese Americans do anything yet, but that's because they're so subtle. They're doing it all secretly. Well, how do you combat that kind of argument?
Right.
They either have done it or they haven't, and if they haven't, they're guilty because they're just stealthy planners.
Right.
And that's the kind of argument that the court seems to be. And actually, the argument in this case, in this order that I just read, which may already have been violated, I don't know, but they say the government is just beating a dead horse. The prisoners have already arrived in El Salvador.
They're there. What can you do about it?
And my attitude is, but who beat the horse? Why is the horse dead?
Right.
The horse is dead because the orders were ignored.
Yes.
And, we go back to Reverend Niemöller, right? Niemöller.
I don't know. You're going to have to tell me that one again.
He's a German pastor, and he says, they came after the communists, and I wasn't a communist, so I didn't say anything. They came after the socialists, and I didn't say anything. They came after the Catholics, and finally they came after me, and there was nobody left to protect me. That's the danger here. It's not, I won't say it's immaterial if you're one of these, particularly if you're innocent and you're one or more of these 300 people.
Absolutely.
This is going to have a major impact on your life. But the impact on our country could be just much more consequential for all of us.
Right.
If judges routinely think that they can, or the government routinely thinks they can ignore judicial orders. And along with this, as you know, in a related case, President Trump has said, well, we need to impeach judges. Now, this is coming from someone who alleges that impeachment was improperly used against him twice during the presidency. And he wants to make impeachment, which is designed to be for bribery, treason, or high crimes and misdemeanors,
against
to
all
go
Democratic
against
judges.
anyone who disagrees with the president. We're back to the Sedition Act of 1798, which is was the one passed in conjunction with this other.
Yeah, we're getting to the point where it's just political. As if you were appointed by a Democratic president, then we've got to get rid of all of you and replace them. Next time, if we get a Democratic president, we get rid of all of the Republican judges. This is not good for the judiciary.
Had the same thing with the Federal Trade Commission. Has two. These commissions generally have like 3 and 2. 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and then whoever the current president is. President just dismissed the 2 Democrats on the Federal Trade Commission. This is dangerous territory. It goes beyond checks and balances. It goes beyond. We've talked. I don't necessarily believe the branches of government are equal, but they're coordinate.
Yes.
They each have responsibilities.
Specific powers and duties.
Right.
And responsibilities.
And Congress has a specific power to declare war.
Yes.
The president has a specific power as commander-in-chief, but the judiciary is still there to make sure that we're within proper constitutional boundaries.
They're the ones who review the constitutionality, the legality of different cases, different laws, and make a decision.
Right. And it's not an impeachable offense to have been appointed by a Democrat president.
Nor is it an impeachable offense to make a decision. Whichever way it goes, it's a decision. And if it's in the district court, which these are, it can be appealed, which is the right, normal legal process.
And by the way, something fairly unusual this week. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court pushing back against a president who calls for impeachment. He says, hold on.
In public.
We long ago established, and it goes all the way back to the impeachment of Justice Chase during the Jefferson administration, that even egregious statements by a judge are not a cause for impeachment. They may be a cause for appeal.
Sure.
And it may very well be that they'll get a little browbeating if it gets to the Supreme Court and they say, why did you even take this case?
Of course.
But to try to remove judges from office simply because they disagree with you is not going to get us very far.
No, and so let's go through real quick the order of the orders. I think the timeline is important as to one of the points that I want to make is, so it's, I've pulled up my own calendar. So Friday the 14th of March is when President Trump signed the executive order declaring this act. On Saturday, it was either, this is a little unclear as to when the lawsuit was filed, originally on behalf of 5 of the Venezuelan detainees who were sent to Texas first, at least one of whom is being alleged by the defense attorneys as, okay, he has some gang tattoos, but they're not related, or he got out of the gang. There's something where they believe he is not a part of the gang. And on Saturday morning, the judge, and this is, I want to make sure I get it right. This is D.C. federal judge, district court federal judge James Boasberg. He issues an order Saturday morning. And this is an application for the 5 applicants, the 5 plaintiffs. And he says, you cannot remove these 5 plaintiffs from the country. They must stay.
And he initially does it verbally, right?
No, I think this one was, well, I think it was both. And I can't be sure. I know that at least it was verbal. I think this one was actually written in the morning. And then he says, okay, we're going to have a hearing Saturday afternoon. I mean, this is extraordinary that the judge is called in, that this is filed. He steps in on a weekend and says, we're going to have a hearing at 5:00 to determine whether they can be removed. And it's huge notice, right? The judge puts them on notice. We have a hearing at this time on this day, and the hearing is to determine whether they can be removed by this law, through this law. And he expands the Saturday morning order to include any non-citizens, is how he phrases it. Not just the 5, but any individuals who are non-citizens in federal custody who could be targeted through this act. So he expands it almost like a plaintiff's class action, where he expands the order. Then he says, we're going to have a hearing. Now, during the hearing, which is in the evening, somewhere 5 to 8 p.m. I don't know the actual times. He's alerted by the plaintiffs that there are planes already in the air. And I understand, Dr. Vial, what you're saying is maybe he overreached by saying turn the planes around, but hold that in abeyance for the moment. At least one of the planes is indicated. There are 3. There's one that is indicated after an actual verbal order is said of do not deport anymore and turn the planes around. So we've got a 2-parter. And the 3rd plane was still sent out. To this day, it's currently Wednesday the 19th, and there were hearings again Sunday the 16th, Monday the 17th, at least, and the government is being told, you've got to cough up these facts. It is alleged that you were willfully violating these orders. And in fact, and in this case, I don't know how you can get any more clear that there's a violation when the Customs and Border Czar says in public on Monday, quote, "We're not stopping. I don't care what the judges think. I don't care what the left thinks. We're coming." So that said, and then we
this
have...
This is not, by the way, it's not a left-right issue.
No, I don't think it is either.
We're not deporting people because they're communists.
Or because they're Democrat, or because they're...
Right.
It's not a party issue.
Well, we might be deporting because they're Democrats.
Well, at this point, I'm afraid I'm going to be deported, or you're going to be deported because we're disagreeing with Donald Trump. And that's the fear and the question here that I think you're getting to is underlying all of this, the danger is, will we be and you can think that whoever's listening can think that I'm overreacting, but I don't think that we are, because this is a slippery slope of we're going to remove all the Democrat judges. We're going to remove people who disagree with me. At what point do we start incarcerating the people who just disagree? Okay, maybe we can't deport you and me, Dr. Vial, but what do we do with us because
nobody
we're
else
in disagreement, right? Nobody
we're
wants
safe.
Those. True. But so Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, also said, this is in public, quote, "The administration did not refuse to comply with the court order. The order, which had no lawful basis, was issued after terrorist TDA aliens had already been removed from the U.S. territory." So here's where we get into my issue. I don't care about the plane issue. What I care about is there is a fundamental disobeyance, noticed disobeyance of an order and a possible order.
We had talked earlier about your experience in family law, and I don't know as much about family law, but I think it's pretty applicable here.
Thank you.
Something that maybe people would others would understand who would not typically be involved in foreign policy kind of things.
Absolutely. So I'm going to draw the example from family law, and then I'll use another for criminal law. Both, I think, are fairly applicable. In my court hearings, I am given notice, just like this one. There's an order made of do XYZ, and we're going to have a hearing about a particular issue. Both parties are going to show up. They're going to argue, and I'm going to make a decision. Then you're going to act on my decision. I cannot, as a private attorney, even as a government attorney when I was a prosecutor, or a court appointed when I was for public defense, there was no way we could go into that hearing saying, "Oh, Judge, I've already made your decision and done this, so now just enter an order on my behalf." No, you have to hold whatever is happening with that issue. So for instance, family law, you've got a custody case. There's an emergency hearing. And this is where emergency cases do come in. I had one where I had an emergency where the mother, it was deemed as, taking the child. And it was against a court order. The court had just ordered the child is to remain in the father's custody. I was representing the father. I put in an emergency petition saying the child hasn't been turned over. Have the child turned over, then have a new hearing if we need to as to whether this is an appropriate order or whether it needs to be expanded to include some visitation or custody by the mother. So we then have a hearing set where we are supposed to determine what happens with the child. The mother runs off with the child. That's specifically and purposefully in defiance of an order that's already been issued and in defiance of a potential order, where what you have to do as each party is you have to hold whatever's happened. So in a family custody dispute, if there's an order or a potential order on a motion where the hearing comes in, you argue, the mom or the dad can't take the child, and one of the attorneys stands up and says, well, sorry, they're already on their way back to India. Oops, sorry.
Oopsie, that was actually the term, right?
Yeah, we'll be the Salvadorian president. Oopsie.
Yes.
Already done. We'll put a laughy emoji. You no longer have jurisdiction because my lady's already on a plane with the child headed toward India. How is that any more appropriate? How is Trump's action any more appropriate than this one with family law? Similarly, if we've got a bond hearing for criminal law, where a probation officer says, we're trying to revoke bond. We think that this potential criminal who's out on probation has violated his terms of probation. We have a hearing on a Monday or a Friday afternoon. I come in, as an attorney, if I've told my guy, go ahead and leave. They can't catch you. They can't put you in custody if you're not there. Well, I have violated so many ethical rules, professional rules of conduct. I should be disbarred.
And let me add something here that may be important. Part of what's happening, now this is tricky because there are national secrets.
True.
Negotiations. Sure. There are some complicating factors here. But apparently, the representatives of the government are unwilling or unable to answer specific questions from the judge as to what they knew and when they knew it and what orders they made.
But in this case, we know they knew about the pending hearing.
Right.
And they have a duty, knowing about the pending hearing and the orders that were already entered, to stop, to not deport them. So if the attorneys encourage them to deport them so that they're over international waters, or they didn't get it in time for the order, or the order was verbal versus written, this is playing fast and loose with what the requirements are of court
and what
orders.
A judge can do, right? Mm-hmm. A judge has the power, and here's why I think they don't want to answer. Now, we do have a Fifth Amendment, right?
Absolutely.
Which gives you the guarantee against having to testify against yourself. But if they testify that they knew this and they violated anyway, they could be fined in contempt.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
The attorneys and
disbarred,
the government.
Right? Eventually, that could lead to disbarment.
Yes, it absolutely could. And here's the question of the remedies, right? Because the government's like, what remedy can you do? They're gone. Right. We're not going to get them back. We don't have jurisdiction over El Salvador and their prison. We can't do anything, but there is that question that you bring up of what is the remedy, at least against those who participated, and what happens in the future. So,
and by the way, Trump may have really put some people in legal jeopardy.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean,
absolutely.
Most people, frankly, if you look particularly at Rudy Giuliani and a number of others that have been associated closely with legal defenses, they've ended up, some of them, in very serious legal trouble.
Oh, significant. And he's out. He's not contributing to their legal defense. He's not helping them.
Right.
They've been destroyed.
You would hate to have a client like this who would potentially expose you to contempt or some kind of charges, and himself maybe get by with it.
Absolutely. And we're going to touch a little bit more on this particular subject in our next part with the Brown University teacher who was deported as well. But as part of what you're saying, and a little foretaste of it, is the attorneys can be held in contempt. They can be referred to the bars of their specific states and jurisdiction, and they could be disbarred if they gave actual legal advice to violate a court order by whichever judge. It doesn't matter if it's the district court or the appellate court. If all of us attorneys, how many millions of us are there? If all of the attorneys in the U.S. say, well, I don't have to obey a district court order, I'll just wait for the appeal. Then where are we? If we can just disregard a court order depending on, well, I don't like this judge and I don't like his opinion or her opinion, or it's just a district court. What if I say it's just the Juvenile and Domestic Relations Court in Virginia? Well, that shouldn't matter. I don't have to obey that. If I didn't like the ruling, I don't have to obey
back
it.
To this, we've sort of been through this territory before in the 1960s.
Yes.
We had what almost everyone today regards as unjust laws. They provided for racial segregation.
Yes.
And Dr. King and others said, we're willing to violate the law,
right,
but we're going to do it in a way that it upholds the law, in that we're willing to accept the punishment for it.
Yes.
In hopes that eventually these laws, it will call enough attention that these laws will be overturned.
And
so
women's suffrage.
There's a respectful
how many
way.
People went to how many women went to jail for that, and then starved themselves? And I mean,
yes.
Right. But in this case, the players. So what grounds could be done against the government? I'm not sure. That's unknown territory. Is what sanctions could be made by or against a government by any judge. And the bigger question is, okay, I entered an order. You were supposed to follow the order. You have to follow future orders. And this is where I think the Supreme Court is going to have to get involved, and unfortunately fairly quickly, to decide and determine, can Trump violate these orders? Can he disregard them as the executive branch?
If I were on the Supreme Court now, interestingly, Chief Justice Roberts has indicated that you shouldn't be impeaching judges for their views.
Right.
But if the court gets a variety of challenges, which there are lower court judges that have already said that DOJ is conceivably unconstitutional because
Correct.
You have someone who is exercising the position of a principal officer who has not been confirmed by the Senate.
As a
You have
cabinet
someone
member,
else who has said the canceling of USAID is probably unconstitutional.
Right.
I think
we have another that's saying the mass firing of certain individuals and in certain organizations is potentially unconstitutional.
That's right. The Department of Education has had a challenge there. I think one of the saddest things, and maybe it's because I one time had the privilege of appearing on Voice of America, but for 75 years, we have been. This is a great example of soft power. Mm-hmm. I mean, the time I was interviewed, I can't say that there was no propaganda on Voice of America because I don't listen to it regularly,
sure.
But I know I was called to deal with something dealing with constitutional amending process. And it was just simply a way of showing other people, here's how a constitution works. Here's what's right and here's what's wrong.
In the American democracy.
To lose your job, or to lose your job, USAID, because you're distributing birth control information or AIDS medicine to people who would otherwise die. I think there are going to be a lot of these cases, and my suspicion is that the court's not going to start with one dealing as directly with foreign policy as it will with one of these others.
The domestic.
Because presidential powers are again, Congress has the power to declare war, but presidential powers are heightened, particularly when it comes to foreign relations with foreign countries, foreign governments. And if I were on the court and I had the choice, I would probably pick a case that didn't deal as directly with foreign policy to challenge it. And again, even though we both understand that just because you're accused of being a gang member doesn't mean you are, it might be that the court would choose it would be more sympathetic perhaps to say, you fire journalists who are telling
Sure.
people in totalitarian countries what democracy is about, or you fired people who are keeping people from dying of malaria.
Right.
They might be better cases for the court to take, at least
Yeah.
initially.
But the biggest question is, even if the Supreme Court makes a decision against the government, will Trump follow that or disregard that too?
And that, in my judgment, although I'm not advocating impeachment of the president, but that could be considered an impeachable offense. It is a lawless, or potentially a lawless act. Presidents, there are very few cases in American history where presidents have directly defied courts. Now, there's some apocryphal examples. Andrew Jackson reputedly said the Supreme Court has made its decision, now letting him enforce it. But apparently he did actually enforce it. Abraham Lincoln sort of ignored a lower court judgment during the Civil War. But apart from that, it's hard. Even Richard Nixon, who had said, he would not necessarily follow a non-definitive court decision, when he got a definitive court decision, said, okay, I'd like to hide these tapes, but I can't do it any longer.
Right. And even we were talking about the segregation issue. Is the president didn't agree with it, but he still forced the segregation of the schools, or the desegregation
That's right.
of the schools.
President Eisenhower, when he sent troops into Little Rock, Arkansas, I'm not so much sure that he was sort of a gradualist. He thought that if you had enough time, desegregation would happen without orders, and he was not a strong supporter of Brown versus Board. But when a governor said, we're not going to desegregate our schools, and the court said yes, he said, it's my obligation as president to enforce the laws.
To enforce the Supreme Court order. And that's what he did. So the final question for you on this second piece is, we asked at the very beginning, and everybody's been on pins and needles, or at least I have, is, as our Constitution expert, do you believe that this particular piece, especially with the violation of the court orders or any other, has brought us to an actual constitutional crisis?
Let's put it this way. So far, we've had more violation of unwritten norms than we have of actual court orders or actual laws. The first seems to be preparing the way for the second. There's enough ambiguity. Well, there's a little bit of ambiguity about this one case that I think we don't know at this point. It's certainly a time for people to take heed. Don't wait till all the communists and socialists and everybody but you has been incarcerated,
based on the Sturman,
well, who's going to protect me? Rights come in bundles, or maybe a better would be, they're like balls of yarn, and once it starts to unwind, it can happen a lot more quickly maybe than people anticipate.
Okay, so stay tuned with us. This was number 2, essentially, of Trump defying what we believe, and the administration defying court orders. So part 3, pick that up next. That is going to be about the deportation of the Brown University professor and doctor. Catch that. Recently, we're going to try to do that fairly close in time with this one that we're putting out, and go back and catch the one. I'm going to make sure I've got the title right. SCOTUS says Trump must turn over $2 billion for USAID. So check that one out. That's essentially our first of this 3-part series, and we will catch you next time on the Legal Weekly Wine.